I was folding laundry on a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, and I remember thinking how peaceful life had been for the past few months. I'm Eleanor Watson, and for 43 years, I've been a nurse, trained to notice when something doesn't quite add up. But on that particular day, I missed every single warning sign, and it almost cost my granddaughter everything. My name is Eleanor, and this is the story of how a neighbor's gift nearly destroyed my family. I'd recently retired, and if I'm honest, I was struggling with the silence that came with it. 43 years of alarms, beeping monitors, urgent footsteps, and the weight of knowing that people's lives were in your hands. And then suddenly, nothing but quiet mornings and empty afternoons. My husband William was still working, traveling constantly for his financial consulting firm. We'd spend maybe 3 weeks a month together if I was lucky, and the rest of the time, it was just me in our suburban home in Connecticut. Our daughter Rachel lived about 40 minutes away with her family, including our granddaughter Julia, who was 12 years old. Julia had started spending more time with us since my retirement, which had been the brightest part of my adjustment to leaving nursing. Having a child around, someone who needed guidance and attention, helped fill the void that work had left. That morning, Julia had come over straight from school. She was in 7th grade, that peculiar age where she was no longer quite a child but not yet a teenager in the ways that mattered most. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's serious eyes. I loved watching her move through the world with such careful observation. She reminded me of myself at that age, cautious, thoughtful, and deeply concerned with doing the right thing. I'd made her favorite snack, chocolate chip cookies, and we'd fallen into our usual routine of sitting at the kitchen table while she told me about her day. She mentioned her classes, her friends, what they'd learned in history. It all seemed wonderfully normal. It was the kind of afternoon that grandmothers live for, those small moments of connection and continuity. Around 3:30, Julia excused herself to use the bathroom, and I started gathering the laundry from the upstairs bedrooms. I was in the hallway folding towels when Julia's backpack, which she dropped by the bedroom door, toppled over. A small prescription bottle rolled out, the kind that doesn't usually contain anything good news. But it wasn't a prescription bottle, not really. It was one of those small amber bottles, the kind you'd get from a health supplement store, but there was no label on it. My hands froze mid-fold. In my entire nursing career, I'd seen enough unmarked medications to know that unmarked medications are never good. I picked it up and my stomach dropped. Inside were small white pills, maybe 20 or 30 of them, and on the bottom of the bottle, in careful handwriting, was a note that read, "Take one every morning with breakfast. It's our secret, Julia. Love, Caroline." My heart started racing in a way I hadn't felt since my last shift in the emergency room. I stood there, holding this mysterious bottle, and suddenly all the pieces of the past 3 weeks started reorganizing themselves in my mind like a puzzle that had seemed incomplete until this very moment. 3 weeks ago, our neighbor, Miss Caroline Whitmore, had moved into the house directly across the street. She was a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of effortless elegance that made you feel slightly underdone just by standing near her. She'd made a point of introducing herself to me, bringing over a casserole, which, I realize now, was such a deliberate move, such a calculated introduction. She'd been particularly interested in meeting Julia when she was visiting, asking questions about her schoolwork, her interests, what she liked to do in her free time. At the time, I'd thought it was just neighborly kindness, the kind of warmth you hope people show each other. But now, standing in my upstairs hallway with that bottle in my hand, it felt sinister. I took a deep breath, the kind they teach you in nursing school to center yourself before delivering bad news. Then I walked downstairs and found Julia in the living room, doing her homework. I didn't want to alarm her. I didn't want her to think she'd done something wrong. Everything in my training told me that this moment required delicacy, but it also required truth. I sat down next to her and asked her, as calmly as I could manage, about Miss Caroline and the pills. Julia's face went pale. She explained that Miss Caroline had approached her 2 weeks earlier, saying that she'd noticed Julia seemed tired in school, that her grades might improve if she took something to help her focus and have more energy. Miss Caroline had told Julia that these were special vitamins, completely natural, something her own daughter had used when she was Julia's age. She'd made Julia promise not to tell anyone, saying that sometimes parents didn't understand how much their children needed help, and that it would be their special thing, something that would make Julia stronger and smarter. I felt my chest tighten. In all my years in medicine, I'd learned to recognize manipulation, the specific way that predators and people with bad intentions talk. They isolate. They create secrets. They frame their actions as help, as gifts, as special bonds. They target the vulnerable. And my beautiful, trusting granddaughter had been walking right into it. I kept my voice steady and told Julia that she'd done nothing wrong, that she was incredibly brave for telling me, and that we were going to figure this out together. But inside, I was running through every possible scenario, every terrible thing this could be, every way this could have escalated if I hadn't found that bottle. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 500 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to All of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. I called my best friend Dorothy that evening. Dorothy is a retired pharmacist, someone I've known since nursing school, someone whose judgment I trust implicitly. She came over within the hour, and I showed her the bottle. She examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands, reading that note again and again. Her face grew darker with each passing second. She took the bottle to her home study, where she had retained some basic equipment from her pharmacy years, and she ran a preliminary analysis. What she found made my blood run cold. The pills weren't vitamins. They contained a mild sedative, something typically prescribed for anxiety or sleep disorders, mixed with what appeared to be an appetite suppressant. They were prescription-strength medications that had been repackaged into unmarked pills. Someone, Miss Caroline, had been giving my granddaughter medication without her parents' knowledge or consent, and more than that, medication that could have serious side effects in a child. Dorothy and I sat in her kitchen at midnight, drinking coffee neither of us wanted, trying to process what this meant. We discussed the possibilities. Was this some kind of psychological manipulation? Was there a deeper motive? Was Miss Caroline targeting other children in the neighborhood? We talked about contacting the police, but we knew they'd need more information, more evidence. We talked about confronting Miss Caroline directly, but we both knew that was dangerous. Not physically dangerous, but dangerous in the sense that she might disappear, might continue this behavior elsewhere, might destroy evidence. We needed to be smart. We needed to be strategic. The next morning, I called my daughter Rachel and told her everything. Rachel was furious, then terrified, then furious again. She wanted to march over to Miss Caroline's house immediately, but I convinced her to wait, to let us gather more information first. I also called William, who was in Chicago for a consulting meeting. He came back on the first flight he could catch. By the time he arrived home that evening, our entire family was in crisis mode, though we were careful not to let Julia know the full extent of our concern. We told her that the pills weren't safe, that we were going to make sure she never had to take anything like that again, and that she should never accept anything from anyone without telling us first. What happened next was a series of discoveries that became increasingly disturbing. I did what any retired nurse with access to old connections would do. I called a friend who still worked at the local police department. Detective Marcus Torres came to our house and took a formal statement from Julia. He took the bottle, though he warned us that without knowing exactly what was in it, it would be difficult to press charges. He asked us questions about Miss Caroline. Had anyone else reported her? Did she have any connections to the school? Did we know anything about her background? None of these questions had good answers. We knew almost nothing about her, really. She was new to the neighborhood, wealthy based on the expensive car in her driveway and the renovations she'd immediately begun on her home, and she was pleasant and helpful and interested in people in that way that should have made me suspicious from the very beginning. Detective Torres said he'd investigate, but he also warned us that without more evidence, without more victims coming forward, it would be difficult to make anything stick. He suggested we document everything, that we keep detailed records of any further contact between Miss Caroline and Julia, and that we consider whether we wanted to pursue this or simply ensure our own child's safety and move on. That last suggestion infuriated me. I'm not someone who moves on when a predator is operating in plain sight. I'm not someone who thinks that just because something is difficult to prosecute, it should be ignored. So William and I made a decision. We were going to figure out who Miss Caroline Whitmore really was, and we were going to make sure that no other child in our community fell victim to whatever her plan was. William, it turned out, had some connections through his financial consulting work. He spent several evenings on the phone with people he knew in various industries, people who could access background information, who could trace financial records. What we discovered was shocking in its ordinariness. Caroline Whitmore had moved to Connecticut from Rhode Island. Before that, she'd lived in New York. Before that, Boston. She had no criminal record, no documented complaints, nothing that would flag her as dangerous. But her financial records told a different story. She had recently settled a lawsuit with a family in Rhode Island. The details were vague, sealed records, confidentiality agreements, but the amount was substantial enough to suggest that something serious had happened. William hired a private investigator, and within 2 weeks, we had the confirmation we needed. 7 years earlier, in Providence, Rhode Island, Miss Caroline Whitmore, then going by her married name, Caroline Henderson, had been accused of giving prescription medications to 2 adolescent children in her neighborhood. The parents had discovered it, just as we had, and they'd hired a lawyer and made a settlement. The families had signed non-disclosure agreements, which is why there was no public record, no way for law enforcement to know about her history. She'd simply moved and started again, and now she was here in our neighborhood, targeting our granddaughter. When the investigator presented us with this information, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't a desperate woman with a misguided maternal impulse. This was a predator with a pattern, someone who was deliberately and methodically targeting children. I made the decision then to contact those families in Rhode Island. It took some work. Dorothy knew a lawyer who specialized in these kinds of cases, and the lawyer helped me navigate the confidentiality agreements to find a way to reach them. I told them what had happened to Julia. I told them that we believed Miss Caroline was still operating, that she was still targeting children, and that I thought it was time for her to be stopped permanently. The family I spoke with, the Hendersons, were initially hesitant. They'd signed agreements that prevented them from discussing their case. But they also had a daughter who is now a teenager, a daughter who still had nightmares about the experience, a daughter who had trust issues because of what Miss Caroline had done to her. They connected me with their lawyer, and together, we began building a case. What became clear as we dug deeper was that Miss Caroline's methodology was always the same. She targeted children who seemed lonely or disconnected, children whose parents were busy or preoccupied. She befriended them, gained their trust, and then offered them medication under the guise of helping them. The motivations varied depending on who you asked. Some people theorized that she enjoyed having control over children, that the act of secretly medicating them gave her a sense of power. Others suggested she was trying to collect evidence of negligent parenting, that she was documenting how easily she could slip medications to children without parents noticing, perhaps for some twisted research purpose. But the most likely explanation, according to the lawyer, was that she was grooming them. The medications were meant to make them compliant, easier to control, less likely to resist if she decided to escalate her behavior into something darker. This realization made me sick. It made me understand how close we'd come to something unthinkable, and how much worse it could have gotten if I hadn't found that bottle when I did. I began to understand my role in this with a clarity that cut like a knife. I am a retired nurse, which means I've been trained to notice things, to watch for patterns, to recognize when something is wrong. I am also a grandmother, which means I am supposed to protect the children in my family. And I'd failed on both counts until pure luck and laundry had saved us. Julia could have continued taking those pills. She could have become more and more sedated, more and more compliant, more and more unable to resist or report what was happening. Miss Caroline could have escalated. She could have moved from pills to something else, something worse. The thought of it was paralyzing. But I couldn't afford to be paralyzed. We had a lawyer now. We had documentation. We had the evidence from the Rhode Island families. We had the pills themselves, which had been tested and confirmed to contain prescription medications. And we had Julia's testimony, the account of a brave 12-year-old girl who was willing to talk about what had happened to her. Detective Torres, armed with this new information about Miss Caroline's history, obtained a warrant and searched her home. What they found was disturbing. Caroline had detailed records of her interactions with children in various neighborhoods. She had a notebook where she documented which children she'd approached, which ones had accepted the pills, which ones had potential for further engagement. Julia's name was in that notebook, along with detailed observations about her routines, her vulnerabilities, her personality traits. There were also photographs, innocent in themselves but arranged in a way that suggested an obsessive interest. The discovery of that notebook was the moment when everything shifted from suspicion to certainty. Miss Caroline Whitmore was dangerous and she was methodical, and she was exactly the kind of predator that society often misses because she didn't fit the stereotypical profile. She was a woman. She was well-dressed and articulate. She was not screaming danger from a rooftop. She was subtle and calculated, and that made her exponentially more dangerous than someone who was obvious. The district attorney's office decided to press charges. Miss Caroline was arrested, and her arraignment took place on a cold February morning. I attended, along with William and the families from Rhode Island. We sat in the courtroom and watched as she was formally charged with endangering a minor, administering medication without consent, and conspiracy to commit child abuse. The trial took place 3 months later, and it was one of the most difficult things I've ever been through. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to Miss Caroline's attorney argue that the pills were harmless, that she'd only been trying to help children with their academic performance, that there was no evidence of any intent beyond neighborly concern, it took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to stand up and tell the judge exactly what I thought. But the evidence spoke for itself. The pills, the notebooks, the pattern from Rhode Island. Julia's testimony, given carefully and courageously, looking directly at Miss Caroline as she described what had happened, as she explained how violated and manipulated she'd felt. The judge found Caroline guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. It wasn't the life sentence I'd wanted, but it was justice. In the aftermath of the trial, I spent a long time thinking about what had almost happened and what it meant. I thought about how my years of medical training, my ability to notice patterns and recognize danger, had almost been useless because I'd let my guard down. I'd been so focused on the peace and quiet of retirement, so absorbed in enjoying time with my granddaughter, that I'd failed to notice the predator moving through our neighborhood. But I also realized something else. I'd caught it. Not because I'm superhuman or particularly gifted. I caught it because I was paying attention. I was present. I was there when my granddaughter came home from school, and I was listening when she spoke, and I was watching for the signs that something was wrong. In the end, that presence, that attention, that willingness to notice and act, that's what saved Julia. Julia is fine now mostly. She still sees a therapist, someone who specializes in trauma and manipulation. She's learning to trust her own instincts again, to understand that not all adults have good intentions, and that it's okay to say no and to tell the truth about what's happening to her. She's growing up, moving through adolescence with a kind of hard-won wisdom that no 12-year-old should have to possess. But she's also resilient in a way that makes me proud. She didn't let what happened break her. She let it change her, yes, but not break her. She's stronger now, more aware, more protective of herself and her friends. She's become an advocate in her school for awareness about this kind of manipulation, speaking to other kids about how adults can sometimes hide bad intentions behind kindness. She's used her pain to help others, and that's about as noble as a person can be. William and I recommitted to being present and vigilant. He cut back on his traveling. We established clear protocols with our daughter Rachel about communication, about how Julia would get in touch with us if anything ever felt wrong, about how we'd create a culture in our family where no secret was worth keeping if it was someone else's secret to demand. We changed how we approached trust. We didn't become paranoid, that would serve no one, but we became smarter about it. We taught Julia that good secrets are things like birthday surprises, but bad secrets are things that someone tells you not to tell a trusted adult. We taught her that if someone asks her to keep something hidden from her parents, that's a warning sign. We taught her to trust her gut, because her gut would almost always be right. The neighborhood changed too. After Miss Caroline was arrested, other families began coming forward. 2 other girls in adjacent neighborhoods had been given similar pills by her before she moved to Connecticut. A parent from her yoga class noticed inconsistencies in her stories about where she'd lived and why she'd moved so frequently. The community became more aware, more vigilant, more focused on the idea that monsters don't always look like monsters. They sometimes look like helpful neighbors. They sometimes smile and bake casseroles and ask about your life. They sometimes wear nice clothes and drive nice cars and seem perfectly normal on the surface. But underneath, they're calculating and predatory, and they're counting on the fact that you won't notice because they're doing everything right. I've thought many times about what would have happened if I hadn't found that bottle. If Julia had continued taking the pills, if she'd become more and more sedated and compliant, if Miss Caroline had escalated her behavior, would I have noticed? Would someone have? Or would Julia have become another statistic, another child who didn't speak up because she'd been manipulated into thinking it was normal, into thinking it was her secret to keep? These are the kinds of thoughts that wake me up at 3 in the morning, the kind of thoughts that haunt me even now. But I've learned to transform those thoughts into action. I've learned to use that fear and that guilt as motivation to help other people, to share the story, to make sure that parents and grandparents and anyone who cares about children understands the warning signs. In the months after the trial, I received messages from people all over the country who had similar stories. Parents who'd discovered their children being given unauthorized medications. Families who'd noticed adults taking inappropriate interest in their children. Teachers who'd seen the signs but hadn't known how to act on them. Each story broke my heart, and each story reinforced my understanding that this is not an isolated problem. This is a systemic issue, one that requires awareness, vigilance, and a willingness to trust your instincts even when they tell you something uncomfortable about someone who seems nice. I also learned that the institutional response to these kinds of cases is often inadequate. Miss Caroline could have been stopped before she ever got to Connecticut if the Rhode Island families had been able to publicize her behavior. Instead, they were bound by confidentiality agreements that protected her more than they protected other children. I began advocating for changes in how we handle these cases, for laws that would require disclosure of certain kinds of criminal behavior even when confidentiality agreements are in place, for better communication between jurisdictions about people who pose a danger to children. It's been a long process, and there's still so much work to be done. But what I've learned most clearly through all of this is that stories matter. The stories we tell about what happened to us, the stories we share about danger and protection, and the ways that predators operate, these stories are crucial. They wake people up. They make them notice things they might otherwise miss. They give other people the courage to speak up about their own experiences. That's why I'm telling you this story now. That's why I'm sharing the details of what nearly happened to my granddaughter and what we did about it. Because somewhere, right now, there's probably another person like Miss Caroline moving through a neighborhood, targeting a child, counting on the fact that no one will notice, that no one will speak up, that secrets will be kept. And somewhere else, right now, there's probably a grandmother or a parent or a teacher who is noticing something off but isn't sure if they're overreacting, isn't sure if they should speak up, isn't sure if they have the right to interfere. I want to tell you this. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If an adult is taking unusual interest in a child who isn't theirs, if they're giving gifts, if they're asking for secrets, if they're offering medications or supplements without the parents knowing, these are warning signs. Pay attention to them. Act on them. Speak up. The consequences of staying silent are far worse than the consequences of being wrong about someone. Julia is 16 now, and she's thriving. She has a boyfriend and good friends, and she's involved in school activities, and she's moving through the world with purpose and confidence. She still talks about what happened sometimes, and she still has moments where she's struggling with the betrayal of trust. But she's also using her experience to help others, and she's become an advocate for awareness in her school. She's a testament to the resilience of young people, to their ability to heal even from deep wounds, to their capacity to transform their pain into purpose. And William and I are grateful every single day that we caught what was happening when we did, that we had the resources and the knowledge to intervene, that we didn't let that moment of discovery pass without acting on it. This story doesn't end with Miss Caroline's conviction, though. In some ways, it continues every day. It continues in the conversations we have with Julia about safety and trust. It continues in the work that I do now, speaking to community groups about predatory behavior and warning signs. It continues in the advocacy work I've done with other families, in the push for better legislation and better institutional responses to these kinds of crimes. It continues in the awareness that I carry with me every single day, the knowledge that good intentions and careful attention are not enough to keep children safe, but they're a place to start. I think often about that moment when I was standing in my hallway, holding an unmarked bottle of pills, and everything changed. I think about how quickly life can shift from normal to extraordinary, from safe to dangerous, from comfortable to terrifying. I think about how it all came down to laundry, to being present enough to notice when something had fallen out of a backpack, to taking that moment seriously instead of dismissing it as nothing. And I think about how many times we dismiss small things, how many red flags we ignore because they don't quite fit the narrative we've constructed about the people around us. The most important thing I've learned through this experience is that vigilance is an act of love. When we pay attention to the children in our lives, when we notice changes in their behavior, when we ask questions about who they're spending time with and what adults are asking of them, when we take seriously the small warnings that our instincts give us, that's not paranoia. That's protection. That's what it means to truly care about the safety and well-being of the people we love. And in a world where predators are increasingly sophisticated, increasingly calculated, increasingly good at hiding in plain sight, that kind of attention is more necessary than ever. So this is what I want to leave you with. If you're a parent or a grandparent or anyone who cares about children, be present. Be aware. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Create an environment where children feel safe telling you about uncomfortable interactions with adults, where they know they won't be in trouble for speaking up, where they understand that protecting themselves is always more important than keeping someone else's secret. Teach them about the difference between good secrets and bad secrets. Teach them that their bodies are their own, that no one has the right to touch them without permission, and that if someone tries, they should tell you immediately. Teach them that medications and supplements should only come from their parents or doctors, and that if an adult is offering them something secretly, that's a danger signal. And most importantly, teach them that you love them unconditionally, that you will always believe them, and that you will always protect them, no matter what it takes. That's the lesson I've learned. That's the story I'm telling. That's what almost happened to my Julia, and that's what I did to stop it. This is Eleanor Watson signing off, and I hope that this story, this truth about what nearly happened in my family and in my community, reaches someone who needs to hear it. I hope it wakes someone up. I hope it gives someone the courage to speak up, to intervene, to act on their instincts. And I hope that somewhere, a child is made safer because of the words I've shared with you today. That would make everything, the pain, the fear, the difficult process of trial and justice, worth it. Thank you for listening to my story.